Welcome to Standard 11A. In this standard, we will describe an international peacekeeping organization known as the League of Nations and the mandate system that was created in the Middle East. These are two important outcomes of World War I. The essential questions we'll attempt to answer in this standard is what was the League of Nations and what factors led it to fail, and what was the mandate system and why was it created. Some essential understanding to help us with this. We need to keep in mind that at the end of World War I, there was this sense that war was being put an end to for good. And one result of that was the formation after the war of many international organizations and the writing of many agreements whose purpose was to avoid future conflict. They really thought that at this point in history, humans could put an end to war through the creation of organizations and by writing the proper agreements. The League of Nations and the mandate system are two examples of this spirit that existed after World War I. Okay, so our first piece of essential knowledge is to know a couple of things about the League of Nations. The League of Nations was an international cooperative organization. So by cooperative, we mean working together. The nations of the world who joined the League of Nations agreed that they would work together for the benefit of common purposes, namely to keep the peace. Okay, as we see there, the main purpose of the League of Nations was to prevent future wars. Okay, we see the symbol there of the League of Nations, and in political cartoons of the time, this from the early 1920s, we see the dog here, this ferocious looking pit bull or bulldog of some sort with the collar of war around it. So this is the dog of war, but the muzzle or the harness on the dog is labeled the League of Nations. And just like a muzzle will keep a dog from biting, the idea was that the League of Nations would serve that same purpose, keep war under control, keep it from taking a bite out of humanity again. We see it also in cartoons like this from around the same time, kind of a Noah's Ark sort of story here where the world is safely floating on the ark. The rainbow overhead is the League of Nations, and we see the world safely floating on the stormy waters of war, the League of Nations sort of leading the way. Okay, so there was this very hopeful feeling about the League of Nations that it was what was needed to prevent future wars. Okay, of course, we know that that didn't quite work out. Two real big reasons here. First is that the United States did not join this. Even though this was really the idea of the American President Woodrow Wilson to create the League of Nations, the U.S. Senate, in ratifying the treaty, didn't want any part of an international organization that put obligations on the United States. We see in this political cartoon the half-finished bridge, where we see countries who have joined the League of Nations, but notice there in the red circle the USA brick, not just any brick, but the keystone that holds the bridge together isn't in place. Uncle Sam is using it as a backrest instead of putting in place on the bridge. That was a big factor in its lack of success. An even bigger reason was that the League of Nations, despite all the good intentions, it didn't have the power to enforce its own decisions. We see sort of that lack of power that the League of Nations had in this political cartoon, where we see Japan and China fighting in the early 1930s. And there's the member countries of the League of Nations all standing outside the door. They're all pointing. They're pointing out that Japan and China are fighting, maybe even yelling into the room to stop fighting, but nobody's able to go in and actually stop it. The League of Nations lacked any power to enforce the decisions that its member countries came up with. Okay, the second piece of essential knowledge has to do with the mandate system. Okay, and that term mandate, just like we saw the term sphere of influence that we want to associate with China, the word mandates we want to associate with the Middle East during this time. Okay, so during World War I, England and France, as they're fighting the Ottoman Empire, as the war is going on, they're already planning what to do with how to divide up the Ottoman Empire. And they negotiate a secret agreement known as the Sykes-Picot Agreement. This was negotiated in secret, and it basically carved up the Ottoman Empire. In the event that the Allies won the war, England and France were victorious, this is what would happen to the land controlled by the Ottoman Empire. And that land, as we see on the map, really controls, or really occupies much of the modern-day Middle East. Okay, we see here, this is the map that the agreement put together, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, divided up the areas in blue into a French-controlled area in dark blue and a French protectorate, a French influence area in the light blue, and for England, a directly controlled area in the dark red, and a protectorate, an influenced area by England in the light pink. Okay, we see the area of Palestine, modern-day country of Israel there in yellow, which was set aside as an international zone under this agreement. Okay, once the war ends, that agreement really becomes the basis of the mandate system. Okay, but the mandate system that forms after the war is actually over is even more defined. Okay, no more is it going to be direct control and influence areas. It's going to be the French and the English controlling this area. Okay, so it's important for us to know which countries were given to France and which ones were given to England. Okay, the modern day countries of Lebanon and Syria were given as mandates to be administered by France. Okay, essentially, they were colonies to be ruled by the French. Okay, the areas of Palestine, what was known as at the time Transjordan and Iraq, those were given as mandates to the English. Okay, so we have to keep in mind on the map here which countries were given to England, which ones were given to France. The importance of this, and this really I think is one of these topics that's become even more important in our modern day world. The division of the Ottoman Empire by the mandate system between the French and the English 100 years ago now almost really planted the seeds for many of the modern day conflicts that we see occurring in the Middle East. Right now, the Middle East really is the hotspot in the world in terms of conflict. And a lot of that traces its roots back to this period of time when the English and French divide up. A lot of it has to do with conflicting messages that were sent, especially by the British during the war. For example, we'll look at a couple of correspondence here. In 1915, the British High Commissioner for Egypt sent a letter to the Sharif of Mecca, an important Arab leader. This was known as the McMahon Correspondence, in which basically the English agreed to the formation of an independent Arab state in this region in exchange for Arab support during the war to defeat the Ottoman Turks. Okay, the Arabs wanted the Turks' rule over them ended. The English were saying, hey, if you help us out defeat our enemy in the war, the Turks, we'll support you getting an independent country in this region. Okay, 2 years later, a very different letter here. This was the Balfour Declaration, written from an important member of the British government to Lord Rothschild, who was an influential Jewish leader in England, essentially promising the Jewish population a homeland in some of that same area that the previous letter had promised land to the Arabs. Okay, so now the British have essentially promised both sides what they wanted. In the meantime, in between, first letter was 1915, second letter was 1917. In 1916, the Sykes-Picot Treaty or agreement had already divided up that land between France and England without any land being given over to either the Arabs or the Jewish population. So in order to gain support during the war, the English were kind of playing both sides against each other, and then at the end really pulled the rug out from underneath both. Okay, and that left kind of a tense situation, which we still see even today. We'll get to this in later standards when we see the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians today, okay, over control of the land in this region. Even more recently, the Syrian conflict going on, the Syrian civil war, a lot of that traces its roots back to this division of the Ottoman Empire at the end of World War I into mandates. And that concludes what we need to know for Standard 11A.